The morning sun cast long shadows across the tranquil waters of Pearl Harbor as Seaman First Class James Rasmussen climbed the ladder to his battle station aboard the USS Arizona. It was Sunday, December 7th, 1941, and the 20-year-old sailor from Iowa had been looking forward to a leisurely morning after church services. The Pacific Fleet lay at anchor like sleeping giants, their massive hulls reflecting the golden Hawaiian sunrise. At precisely 7:48 in the morning, the Serenity shattered. Commander Mitsusu Fukita, leading the first wave of Japanese aircraft, gave the fateful order that would echo through history. Tora! 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 The coded message signaled that complete surprise had been achieved against the American naval base. Rasmussen heard the distinctive whine of diving aircraft before he saw them. Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers skimmed impossibly low across the harbor's surface, their rising sun emblems clearly visible on their wings. The first explosion sent geysers of water and debris skyward as torpedoes found their marks against the anchored battleships. "This is no drill," screamed Lieutenant Commander Samuel Fuqua over the ship's communication system as the USS Arizona trembled under the first impacts. Sailors who moments before had been enjoying coffee and conversation now scrambled to their battle stations, many still in their Sunday whites. The coordinated Japanese assault was the culmination of months of meticulous planning by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of this bold strike against American naval power in the Pacific. Yamamoto had argued that Japan's only hope of victory against the industrial might of America lay in delivering a crippling blow before the United States could fully mobilize its resources. From his position on Fort Island, Rear Admiral Patrick Bellinger watched in horror as wave after wave of enemy aircraft swept across the harbor. The attacking force consisted of 183 aircraft in the first wave alone, including 40 Kate torpedo bombers, 49 Kate high-level bombers, 51 Aichi dive bombers, and 43 Mitsubishi Zero fighters. The USS Oklahoma, moored alongside the USS Maryland, took the first devastating torpedo hits. Seaman Stephen Young felt the massive battleship lurch as explosions tore through her port side. Water rushed into the breached compartments with terrifying speed, and within minutes, the 37,000-ton vessel began listing heavily to port. Captain Mervyn Benyon of the USS West Virginia maintained his position on the bridge, even as shrapnel from a bomb explosion mortally wounded him. His final orders helped coordinate damage control efforts that would ultimately save his ship from the fate that befell others in Battleship Row. The surprise was complete and devastating. Most of the Pacific Fleet's fighter aircraft remained grounded at Wheeler Field and Hickam Field, where they had been parked wingtip to wingtip as protection against sabotage, a precaution that now made them perfect targets for strafing runs. As the first wave of attacks continued, black smoke billowed across the harbor, mixing with the acrid smell of burning oil and cordite. The peaceful Sunday morning had transformed into a scene from hell, with men fighting desperately to save their ships and their lives. The Japanese had achieved tactical surprise, but they had also awakened a sleeping giant whose response would reshape the entire course of the Second World War. The second wave of Japanese aircraft arrived at 8:54, adding fresh terror to the already devastated naval base. Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki led 171 additional aircraft into the fray, determined to complete the destruction begun by the first assault. Aboard the USS Arizona, Seaman Rasmussen found himself helping to carry wounded shipmates below decks when the unthinkable happened. At 8:06, a modified 16-inch artillery shell, converted into an armor-piercing bomb, struck the battleship's forward magazine. The explosion that followed defied description. A massive fireball erupted skyward, lifting the ship's forward turrets completely off their barbets. The blast killed 1,177 officers and enlisted men instantly. including Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg and Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, who had rushed to the bridge when the attack began. The Arizona settled to the bottom of the harbor, her burning superstructure protruding above the water like a steel tombstone. Pharmacist's mate, first class John Carmichael of the USS Solace worked frantically to treat the growing number of casualties being brought aboard the hospital ship. Burns were the most common injury, as sailors had been caught in the fireballs created by exploding fuel and ammunition. Many men had jumped into the harbor, only to find themselves swimming through burning oil at Wheelerfield. Second Lieutenant George Welch and Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor made a desperate dash to their Curtiss P-40 fighters. Despite being strafed by Japanese Zeros during takeoff, both pilots managed to get airborne and engage the enemy. Taylor shot down 2 Japanese aircraft before being wounded, while Welch claimed 4 victories, becoming some of the few American success stories of that terrible morning. The USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, presented both hope and additional danger. Lieutenant Commander Francis Thomas successfully backed the ship away from her berth, but as she attempted to reach the harbor entrance, Japanese dive bombers concentrated their attacks on the moving target. Realizing that the Nevada might sink in the channel and block the harbor entrance completely, senior officers ordered her to be beached at Hospital Point. Ensign Joe Taussig Jr., serving aboard the Nevada, continued to direct anti-aircraft fire, even after his leg was nearly severed by shrapnel. His actions exemplified the courage displayed throughout the fleet as sailors fought back with whatever weapons they could bring to bear, according to the official Navy Department report released. In 1942, the Japanese attack achieved devastating results in less than 2 hours of combat. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed, 3 cruisers were damaged, 3 destroyers were damaged, and 188 aircraft were destroyed. The human cost was staggering. 2,403 Americans were killed, including 68 civilians, and 1,178 were wounded. The Japanese losses, by comparison, were minimal. 29 aircraft destroyed, 5 MiAT submarines sunk, and 64 personnel killed. Mess Attendant Third Class Doris Miller, an African-American sailor aboard the USS West Virginia, became one of the day's most celebrated heroes. Despite having no formal gunnery training, Miller helped move his wounded captain to safety, then manned a .50 caliber machine gun, shooting down at least 1 Japanese aircraft. His actions would later earn him the Navy Cross, making him one of the first African Americans to receive such recognition. As the Japanese aircraft disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind a scene of unprecedented destruction, survivors began the grim task of rescue and recovery. The surprise attack had succeeded beyond Admiral Yamamoto's expectations, but it had also ensured that America would enter the war with a unified resolve that would prove unstoppable. The news of Pearl Harbor's devastation spread across the globe like wildfire, carried by radio waves and telegraph cables to capitals from London to Moscow. In Washington, D.C., President Franklin Delano Roosevelt received the first reports while meeting with advisor Harry Hopkins. At the White House, the president's immediate reaction was one of controlled fury. He had been hoping to avoid war, but the Japanese had made that impossible. At 10 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, Washington time, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox telephoned the White House with the grim details. "Mr. President, it appears that the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor and inflicted severe damage," Knox reported, his voice heavy with the weight of catastrophe. Roosevelt immediately began drafting what would become one of the most famous speeches in American history. Working with speechwriter Robert Sherwood, the president crafted words that would unite a previously divided nation behind the war effort. The phrase, "a date which will live in infamy," emerged from these urgent deliberations, capturing the moral outrage that would fuel America's war machine. Across the Atlantic, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill received the news at Chequers, his country estate. Despite the tragedy, Churchill felt a surge of relief. America would finally join Britain in the fight against fascism. So we had won after all. Churchill would later write in his memoirs, recognizing that American industrial might would tip the scales decisively against the Axis powers. In the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin initially received the reports with skepticism, suspecting disinformation. However, once the attacks were confirmed, the Soviet leader recognized a crucial strategic opportunity. With America now committed to fighting Japan in the Pacific, the possibility of a two-front war for the Soviet Union had been eliminated. The Japanese leadership in Tokyo celebrated what appeared to be a stunning tactical victory. Admiral Yamamoto, however, expressed private concerns about the long-term consequences. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," he reportedly confided to his staff, understanding better than most the industrial capacity America could bring to bear once fully mobilized. Emperor Hirohito formally declared war on the United States and Great Britain in an imperial rescript read throughout Japan. The carefully orchestrated propaganda portrayed the attack as a defensive measure against Western encirclement, but the reality was that Japan had committed itself to a war it could not ultimately win. In Pearl Harbor itself, the work of rescue and recovery continued around the clock. Captain Homer Wallen, the fleet salvage officer, began the monumental task of assessing which ships could be repaired and returned to service. The USS Oklahoma had capsized completely, trapping hundreds of sailors inside her hull. Rescue crews worked frantically, cutting through the ship's bottom with acetylene torches, while tapping sounds from within indicated men were still alive. Chief Water Tender Peter Tomick of the USS Utah sacrificed his life to ensure his shipmates could escape the capsizing vessel. He remained at his post in the engine room, maintaining steam pressure for the ship's generators until the very last moment. His heroism would later be recognized with the Medal of Honor, awarded posthumously. The attack had also devastated the civilian population of Oahu. 35-year-old Robert Tice, driving to work that Sunday morning, was killed when Japanese aircraft strafed Hickam Field's main gate. Civilian casualties mounted as anti-aircraft shells, fired hastily by defenders, fell back to earth in populated areas. Dr. Pinkerton, chief medical officer at Tripler General Hospital, organized civilian medical personnel to treat the overwhelming number of casualties. Local doctors, nurses, and volunteers worked side by side with military medical staff, demonstrating the unity that would characterize America's war effort. As December 7th drew to a close in Hawaii, the magnitude of what had occurred was becoming clear. The Japanese had achieved tactical surprise and inflicted devastating losses, but they had also guaranteed that the world's greatest industrial power would be committed to their complete defeat. The morning of December 8th brought America face to face with its new reality. President Roosevelt, flanked by military leaders and congressional representatives, stood before a joint session of Congress to deliver his war message. The galleries were packed with citizens and reporters from around the world, all understanding they were witnessing a pivotal moment in history. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Roosevelt declared, his voice carrying across the hushed chamber and to millions of Americans listening on radio. The president's 18-minute speech was interrupted by applause 32 times. When he finished with the words, "I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire." The response was thunderous. Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana cast the only dissenting vote, maintaining her pacifist principles as she had during World War I. Her decision would end her political career, but it demonstrated the democratic principles America was fighting to preserve. Within hours of the declaration, young men across the nation were lining up at military recruitment centers. In Times Square, the line of volunteers stretched for blocks. Factory worker James Sullivan from Detroit abandoned his shift to enlist in the Navy, telling reporters, "They hit us when we weren't looking. Now we're going to hit back harder than they ever imagined." The industrial mobilization that followed dwarfed anything previously seen in human history. Henry Kaiser's shipyards on the West Coast began producing Liberty ships at an unprecedented rate, eventually launching vessels in as little as 4 days. The Willow Run plant in Michigan, designed by Charles Sorensen, would produce one B-24 Liberator bomber every hour at peak production. Meanwhile, in Pearl Harbor, the salvage operations continued with determined efficiency. The USS California, which had settled to the bottom in shallow water, became the focus of intensive efforts. Lieutenant Commander Edward Raymer led diving teams into the flooded compartments, searching for survivors and assessing damage. Against all odds, they found Seaman First Class Ronald Endicott alive in an air pocket after 16 hours underwater. The psychological impact of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond military casualties. Japanese Americans, many of whom were second and third generation citizens, faced immediate suspicion and hostility. In Los Angeles, shopkeeper Kenji Yamamoto, whose son was serving in the U.S. Army, found his store windows broken and "Remember Pearl Harbor" painted on his door. Colonel William Donovan, head of the Office of Strategic Services, began coordinating intelligence operations to prevent future surprise attacks. The failure to anticipate Pearl Harbor had exposed critical weaknesses in American intelligence gathering, flaws that would be systematically addressed as the war progressed. Admiral Chester Nimitz arrived in Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day, 1941, to assume command of the Pacific Fleet. Walking among the wreckage of Battleship Row, the new commander assessed both the damage and the opportunities. "The Japanese made 3 critical errors," he observed to his staff. "They attacked on Sunday when most ships were in port, but most sailors were on shore leave, minimizing casualties. They failed to destroy our fuel storage and repair facilities. And they missed our aircraft carriers, which were at sea." The USS Enterprise, under Captain George Murray, had been delivering aircraft to Wake Island and missed the attack entirely. The USS Lexington was ferrying planes to Midway, while the USS Saratoga was in San Diego undergoing maintenance. These 3 carriers would form the backbone of America's early Pacific counteroffensive. By New Year's Day, 1942, America's transformation was already evident. Plants that had been producing automobiles were retooling for tank production. Housewives were organizing scrap metal drives. Children were buying war bonds with their allowance money. The nation that had been reluctant to enter another foreign war had become united in purpose and determination. The attack on Pearl Harbor had succeeded in its immediate tactical objectives, but it had failed catastrophically in its strategic goals. Instead of paralyzing American will, it had unleashed American industrial and military might on a scale the world had never seen. The months following Pearl Harbor witnessed an extraordinary transformation as America's arsenal of democracy shifted into high gear. By March 1942, factories that had once produced civilian goods were churning out military equipment 24 hours a day. The Ford Motor Company's massive River Rouge plant alone was producing more military hardware than the entire Italian war industry. In the Pacific, Admiral Nimitz was already planning America's counteroffensive. The Doolittle raid on April 18, 1942, while causing minimal physical damage to Japan, provided enormous psychological benefits to American morale. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers from the deck of the USS Hornet, proving that Japan itself was vulnerable to American retaliation. The strategic situation began shifting decisively at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. For the first time in naval history, two fleets engaged each other without the opposing ships ever coming within sight of each other. Carrier-based aircraft did all the fighting, validating the theories of aviation advocates like Admiral William Bull Halsey. Captain Frederick Sherman of the USS Lexington fought his ship brilliantly during the engagement, but internal explosions from aviation fuel vapors eventually forced him to abandon Lady Lex. As the crew evacuated, they maintained perfect discipline, with many sailors stopping to salute the flag before leaving their ship. The Lexington's sacrifice, however, had helped turn back the Japanese advance toward Australia. The decisive confrontation came at Midway on June 4th through 7th, 1942. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16, made the crucial decision to launch his attack while the Japanese fleet was refueling and rearming aircraft. The timing proved perfect. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey leading bombing. Squadron 6 from the USS Enterprise spotted the Japanese fleet just as fuel gauges showed his aircraft were approaching the point of no return. His decision to continue the attack rather than turn back proved decisive. Within minutes, the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were blazing wrecks. Commander Richard Best, piloting one of the dive bombers, scored a direct hit on the Akagi's flight deck, setting off a chain reaction of explosions among the armed and fueled aircraft spotted for takeoff. The same pilot would later damage the Hiryu, completing the destruction of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers in a single day. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, floated in the Pacific for 30 hours after his aircraft was shot down. From his position in the water, he witnessed the entire battle, later providing valuable intelligence about Japanese damage control procedures and tactical formations. The victory at Midway eliminated Japan's most experienced carrier pilots and aircraft losses that could never be adequately replaced. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, recognized that Japan's window of opportunity had closed. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, he would later admit, using the understated language typical of Japanese military culture. Back in Pearl Harbor, the salvage operations continued with remarkable success. The USS West Virginia, raised from the harbor bottom, was completely rebuilt and modernized. When she returned to service in 1944, she was more powerful than when originally constructed. Chief shipfitter Robert Reardon led teams, working in dangerous conditions, often in complete darkness, to strip valuable equipment from sunken vessels. The USS Arizona remained where she had sunk, her crew entombed within her hull. A decision was made to leave her as a permanent memorial to those who died on December 7th. Fuel oil continued to seep from her bunkers, creating a shimmering rainbow on the water's surface that survivors called the Tears of the Arizona. American industrial production reached staggering levels by late 1942. The nation was producing more military equipment than all other combatants combined. Henry Kaiser's shipyards launched their 100th Liberty ship just 10 months after Pearl Harbor, while aircraft production soared from fewer than 6,000 planes annually before the war to over 96,000 in 1944. Attack that was intended to paralyze American naval power had instead catalyzed the greatest military buildup in human history. By the end of 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor, America possessed more aircraft carriers than Japan, and the gap was widening rapidly. The shock of Pearl Harbor reverberated far beyond American shores, fundamentally altering the strategic landscape of World War II. Prime Minister Churchill arrived in Washington on December 22, 1941, for the Arcadia Conference, where Allied grand strategy would be hammered out between the British and American leadership. Churchill's arrival at the White House marked the beginning of an unprecedented alliance between two English-speaking democracies. During their first evening together, Roosevelt and Churchill established the fundamental principle that would guide Allied strategy: Germany first. Despite the devastating attack by Japan, both leaders recognized that Nazi Germany represented the greater long-term threat to democratic civilization. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, worked closely with his British counterpart, General Alan Brooke, to coordinate global military operations. Their collaboration, despite frequent disagreements over strategy and timing, would prove essential to Allied victory. Marshall's insistence on a cross-channel invasion of Europe clashed with Churchill's preference for operations in the Mediterranean, but both approaches ultimately contributed to victory. The Soviet Union, already engaged in a titanic struggle with Nazi Germany, welcomed America's entry into the war. Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov met with Roosevelt in May 1942 to coordinate Lend-Lease aid and discuss the opening of a second front in Europe. American supplies, ranging from trucks and aircraft to food and raw materials, would prove crucial to Soviet survival during the darkest days of the German advance. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, the World War I ace, nearly died delivering a secret message to General Douglas MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific. His aircraft was forced down in the ocean, and he spent 24 days out a life raft before being rescued. His survival became a symbol of American determination and resourcefulness in the face of adversity. The China-Burma-India theater became another crucial front in the global war against Japan. General Joseph Stilwell, commanding American forces in China, worked to supply Chinese nationalist forces under Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. The famous Hump airlift over the Himalayas delivered essential supplies to keep Chinese resistance alive, tying down enormous Japanese forces that might otherwise have been used in the Pacific. In Australia, General MacArthur established his headquarters after escaping from the Philippines. His famous promise, "I shall return," became a rallying cry for American forces throughout the Pacific. The defense of Australia required unprecedented cooperation between American, Australian, and New Zealand forces, forging bonds that would last long after the war ended. The intelligence war took on new dimensions after Pearl Harbor. The successful breaking of Japanese naval codes by the team at Station HYPO in Hawaii, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, provided crucial advantages in subsequent battles. The ability to read Japanese radio traffic had been instrumental in the victory at Midway and would continue to give Allied forces strategic advantages throughout the Pacific campaign. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking jobs previously reserved for men. Rosie the Riveter became an iconic symbol of American homefront dedication. In shipyards and aircraft factories across the nation, women proved they could handle the most demanding industrial tasks. Margaret Mickey Devine of Long Beach, California, became famous for driving rivets faster than any male worker in her plant. The mobilization extended to America's scientific community as well. The Manhattan Project, though still highly classified, was already beginning the research that would eventually produce atomic weapons. Scientists like Robert Oppenheimer and Enrico Fermi were recruited for what they knew only as crucial war research, not understanding they were working to create the most powerful weapons in human history. African American service members faced the dual challenge of fighting fascism abroad while confronting segregation at home. The Tuskegee Airmen, trained at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, would eventually prove that racial integration could enhance rather than harm military effectiveness. Their success in combat helped lay the groundwork for post-war civil rights advances. By December 7, 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor, America had become the arsenal of democracy that Roosevelt had promised. The nation was producing more military equipment than the rest of the world combined, and American forces were engaged on every continent except Antarctica. The surprise attack that was intended to prevent American involvement in World War II had instead guaranteed American leadership in the eventual Allied victory. December 7, 1943, marked the second anniversary of Pearl Harbor. With America firmly on the offensive across the Pacific, the once mighty Japanese fleet that had struck so boldly at Hawaii was now scattered and increasingly desperate, facing the full might of American industrial production and military innovation. Admiral Nimitz stood on the bridge of his flagship, reviewing intelligence reports that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. The Japanese combined fleet, which had appeared invincible after Pearl Harbor, had been systematically degraded through a series of costly engagements. At the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese carrier aviation would suffer such devastating losses that American pilots dubbed it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The technological advances spurred by Pearl Harbor had revolutionized warfare itself. Radar, which might have prevented the surprise attack if properly implemented, now gave American forces decisive advantages in detecting enemy movements. The proximity fuse, developed in absolute secrecy, made American anti-aircraft fire devastatingly effective against Japanese kamikaze attacks. General Curtis LeMay's bombing campaign against Japan demonstrated the long reach of American air power. The B-29 Superfortress, a bomber that existed only on drawing boards when Pearl Harbor was attacked, now carried the war directly to Japanese cities. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9 and 10, 1945, created more destruction than either of the atomic bombs that would follow. The human cost of the Pearl Harbor attack continued to resonate throughout American society. Gold Star mothers who had lost sons in the attack became symbols of sacrifice and dedication. Mrs. Mary Rasmussen of Iowa, whose son James had died aboard the Arizona, traveled across the country selling war bonds and speaking to factory workers about the importance of their contribution to victory. Captain Mitsu Fukita, who had led the first wave of attackers against Pearl Harbor, was seriously wounded during the Battle of Midway. By 1945, he was one of the few surviving Japanese pilots who had participated in the December 7th attack. His post-war conversion to Christianity and friendship with American veterans would symbolize the possibility of reconciliation. Even after the most devastating conflicts, the salvage operations at Pearl Harbor had achieved remarkable success. Of the 18 ships damaged or sunk during the attack, all but 3 were eventually returned to service. The USS Nevada, which had made the valiant attempt to escape during the attack, was completely modernized and participated in the D-Day landings at Normandy before returning to the Pacific for the final assault on Japan. President Roosevelt did not live to see the final victory he had set in motion with his Day of Infamy speech. His death on April 12, 1945, came just months before Japan's surrender, but his leadership had transformed America from an isolationist nation into the leader of the free world. Harry Truman, inheriting the presidency, would face the ultimate decision about whether to use the atomic weapons developed in response to Pearl Harbor's challenge. The Japanese surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, brought the war full circle. Admiral Nimitz, who had taken command of the Pacific Fleet in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor's devastation, now accepted Japan's formal surrender. General MacArthur, who had witnessed the beginning of American involvement in the Pacific War, presided over its conclusion. The lessons of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond military strategy. The attack had demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most powerful nations to surprise assault, leading to the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Council in the post-war period. Never again would America allow itself to be caught so completely unprepared for military aggression. The memorial that rose above the sunken USS Arizona became a place of pilgrimage for Americans and international visitors alike. The ship's bell recovered from the wreckage, was installed in the memorial's shrine room, where it continues to toll in remembrance of those who died. Oil still seeps from the Arizona's fuel bunkers, creating rainbow patterns on the water that visitors call black tears, a permanent reminder of December 7th's cost. The attack on Pearl Harbor had indeed united allies around the globe, creating the most powerful military coalition in human history. From the factories of Detroit to the shipyards of Britain, from the frozen battlefields of Russia to the jungles of Burma, the alliance forged in response to December 7th's aggression had defeated fascism and militarism on a global scale. Date which will live in infamy had become the cornerstone of American global leadership, transforming an isolationist republic into the defender of democratic values worldwide. The surprise attack that was intended to paralyze American will had instead awakened capabilities that even America itself had not fully recognized, changing the course of world history forever.